There's no fear more primal than the thought of losing your child to a stranger. In 2015, a Washington TV station ran a campaign with the hashtag #Shucked every 90 seconds, claiming a child goes missing somewhere in America every 1.5 minutes. The data? A 2002 Justice Department study. Nearly 800,000 children reported missing that year. It sounds catastrophic. But here's what they didn't tell you. Over 99% of those children were found within hours, by family, by police, or walking home on their own. Only 115 were true abductions by strangers. And yet, over the past 2 decades, even that number has dropped. Cell phones, GPS, social media. Parents today can track their kids in real time. The world got safer, or at least more watchful. But some cases don't fade into statistics. They etch themselves into the national memory. On October 25, 1994, Susan Smith stood before cameras, tear-streaked and trembling, begging for her 2 boys back. Michael, age 3. Alexander, just 14 months. Kidnapped, taken, vanished. The nation held its breath. Billboards, news cycles, midnight vigils. Strangers became search parties. The FBI launched one of the largest manhunts in US history. And then, silence. Then, a confession. Not by a monster in the shadows, but by the mother who wept on television. She hadn't lost them to a stranger. She'd drowned them herself. In a lake. With the car still running. The country didn't just grieve, it shattered. Because sometimes the worst nightmares aren't born from fear of the unknown, but from the terrifying truth. The person you trust most can become the thing you feared most. On the night of October 25, 1994, in Union, South Carolina, 911 received a frantic call from a young woman reporting the abduction of 2 young children. Susan Smith, 23, the mother of the boys, had run from her car to a nearby home, pounding on the door for help. As multiple patrol units rushed to the scene, she described the suspect as a black male, approximately 30 to 40 years old, standing around 6 feet tall. According to her account, she had stopped at a red light when the man approached her vehicle, brandished a handgun, and forced her to drive away. After traveling a few miles, he ordered her out of the car. Before she could reach the back seat to free her 2 sons, Michael, 3, and Alexander, just 14 months, who were still strapped into their car seats, the suspect sped off. Smith ran to the nearest house, the home of the McLeod family, and begged for assistance. They immediately dialed 911. Authorities launched an urgent search for a red Mazda automobile linked to Smith. State police combed wooded areas and highways, hoping the kidnapper might have abandoned the children along the route. But no trace of the boys or the vehicle was found. The next day, the FBI joined the investigation. The abduction of Michael and Alexander Smith became national news. Millions watched as Susan and Dave Smith, visibly shattered, appeared on television, pleading with the abductor to return their sons unharmed. Susan provided investigators and the media with numerous photographs and home videos of the boys playing with her, footage that aired relentlessly across every major news network. The case instantly gripped the nation. Hundreds volunteered for search parties. Thousands of flyers were distributed, featuring the description of the red Mazda and a composite sketch of the suspected kidnapper. Yet after 2 full days, investigators had no leads. Not even a single confirmed sighting of the vehicle. In kidnapping cases, the first 48 hours are critical. The complete lack of evidence began to unsettle both local police and federal agents. Suspicion slowly turned towards Susan Smith herself. Her statements contained inconsistencies. She claimed that night she was driving to visit a friend with her 2 children, but it was later confirmed that the friend was not home that evening and had made no plans to see them. Further contradictions emerged. Smith said the abduction occurred at a traffic light that only turned red if vehicles approached from the side. It was sensor-activated. Yet she insisted there had been no other cars nearby at the time. She also claimed to have shopped at a Walmart near 9 p.m. that night, but no employees recalled seeing her or the 2 young boys in the store. Every detail she offered unraveled under scrutiny. Otherwise, the description she gave of the suspect was extremely generic, so much so that the black community in Union began to feel uncomfortable and complain to authorities about various harassments by some law enforcement officers. It was then that police decided to subject Susan and David Smith to a polygraph test. The results only confirmed the investigators' suspicions. Susan failed nearly all the questions and became the primary suspect. The interrogations continued, but the woman insisted on her version of events. In the following days, information leaked to the press, and reports began circulating about inconsistencies in Susan's account. Yet she appeared on camera for a second time alongside her husband, pleading with the kidnapper to return her children, once again stirring public compassion. It was hard not to empathize with the young couple. Multiple sources confirmed that Susan was an excellent mother who never mistreated her children. The entire community stood with her, as did her family. But after this second public appearance, some began to notice something strange in the televised footage. While David Smith's face reflected utter bewilderment, Susan wept bitterly, but without tears. And at times she could even be seen smiling, something completely out of place given the situation. This detail caught the attention of police and even the reporters covering the story. And skepticism around the kidnapping story grew, though taking this stance became extremely unpopular. One reporter would later recall that Susan Smith began to cry just before being interviewed for another television segment. That was the only time he ever saw her with tears in her eyes. Minutes later, when the interview ended, the woman automatically regained her composure. The search intensified, and dives were conducted in nearby lakes and rivers in search of the vehicle or the children's bodies, but nothing was found. By then, the US was shaken by the case, and prayer vigils were organized for the Smith children. But after 8 days of waiting, the chances of finding them alive were already very slim. Baby and Susan Smith gave an exclusive interview to CBS on a morning program hosted by journalist Harvey Smith, and they defended themselves against police suspicions. They sat together, holding hands, while Susan said she didn't understand what the agents meant by inconsistencies in her statement. The day before, Susan's house had been searched by detectives looking for evidence. David defended his wife, insisting she was an excellent mother and that he blindly believed in her. At the same time, Susan said she wasn't hiding anything and could never be capable of hurting her own children. They were married, but had separated and were living independently. Despite all this tragedy, they knew one child and supported each other through the process. After 9 days of intense searching, both police and the FBI decided to change strategy. They were convinced Susan Smith was hiding something and decided to pressure her. After a tense interrogation, the truth came out. The woman broke down and confessed to a monstrous crime. On the night of October 25th, Susan Smith drove with her 2 children seated in the back of the red Mazda along a rural road that led to Lake Jong-ilok. The children were in their respective infant car seats, secured with seat belts. Susan pulled up to the boat ramp, got out of the car, released the handbrake, and engaged the automatic gear shift. In the darkness, the vehicle began to sink slowly until it disappeared completely. Michael and Alexander, who had been asleep, likely woke when water began seeping inside. On November 3rd, 1994, Union County Sheriff Howard Wells held a press conference before a crowd of reporters, where he announced that Susan Smith had been arrested for the murder of her 2 children. The statements left those present stunned. Many began to sob upon hearing the news, while others were outraged. Although Lake Jordan Long had been inspected previously, this time they had Susan Smith's confession, and several dives were conducted until they located the vehicle. One of the divers assigned to the operation recalled submerging with a flashlight and glimpsing the hand of one of the children resting against one of the windows. Finally, the car was brought to the surface with the children's remains inside. Forensic examinations confirmed that Michael and Alexander were still alive when their mother left them to sink into the lake. Both died of drowning. Susan Smith went from being the victim of a tragedy to becoming one of the most hated women in all of America. The question was, why had she done it? Many who knew her couldn't understand what had happened. She was described as a cheerful, extroverted, good neighbor, and an excellent mother. But despite appearances, her life was far more turbulent than anyone in her circle could have imagined. Born in Union, South Carolina on September 26, 1971, she was the youngest of 3 children born to Linda Harbison and Harry Bogart. Very little is known about her childhood beyond the fact that she performed well in school. When she turned 7, her parents divorced, and 3 weeks after the separation, her father shot himself in the head. That event marked her deeply, and she became a much more withdrawn girl. Despite the traumatic experience, only a few months passed before Linda, her mother, remarried. Beverly and Russell, a successful businessman, became her new husband. It was then that they moved to a stylish home in an exclusive neighborhood of Union. The mother thought the change would be beneficial for her children, but for Susan, everything turned out too overwhelming. Depressed and withdrawn, she attempted suicide at age 13 after swallowing several pills. That episode seemed to have been just an anecdote. After recovering, Susan resumed her activities normally. She was a diligent student with good grades and relatively popular in school. But in 1987, when she turned 16, she spoke to her mother and accused her stepfather of sexual abuse. Despite Russell being removed from the house and the girl undergoing multiple interviews with psychologists, ultimately nothing came of it. Shortly after, the man returned to the home without facing any charges. At the same time, Susan's mother appeared ashamed of the situation, but did not end her marriage, even though the abuses continued for years. During her adolescence, Susan maintained several romantic relationships with different men, but none lasted. At 17, she became pregnant and had an abortion. A year later, she made her second suicide attempt. Despite her emotional struggles, she was hardworking and ambitious. In every job she held, she rose through the ranks, in part because she was also highly manipulative. It was then that she began a romance with David Smith, a co-worker. The relationship grew stronger until they married on March 15, 1991. Soon after, their first son, Michael, was born. They were a young couple who seemed to have a promising future. But reality was very different. David felt uncomfortable because Susan spent money recklessly, and her mother, Linda, interfered too much in their relationship. He also discovered that his wife was unfaithful, and he left the house on several occasions, but they always reconciled. The birth of their second child, Alexander, in August 1993, seemed like a ray of hope for the family. But David moved out into an apartment and left, just 3 weeks later. Still, the separation was relatively amicable. David could visit his children whenever he wanted, and Susan placed no restrictions. She wanted to spend more time with them. The boys were well cared for and enjoyed the affection of both parents. Shortly after, Susan got a job at one of the largest textile companies in the area, called Consul, and became an executive secretary after being promoted from accounting. There, she met Don Findley, 27 years old, the son of the company's owner, one of the most sought-after bachelors in Union. In addition to his great wealth, he was known as charming and charismatic, and so Susan did not hesitate to use her charms to seduce him. By January 1994, they began dating. At the same time, she was reconciling with David, but eventually asked for a divorce. A few months passed, and Susan seemed extremely excited about her new romance. But on October 17th of that same year, it all ended. Findley sent her a letter explaining his reasons for ending the relationship. "You're intelligent, beautiful, sensitive, and you have so many other wonderful qualities. You'll surely make a man happy as his wife. But that man won't be me. There are things in your life I can't handle, and by things, I mean your children. I'm sure they're wonderful boys. But no matter how good they are, the fact is, I don't want children. These feelings might change someday, but I doubt it. With everything going on in the world today, I have no desire to bring another life into it, nor do I want to be responsible for someone else's children. But I'm very glad there are people like you who aren't as selfish as I am." The note was devastating. Susan reacted immediately. She confronted him and tried to regain his attention, revealing she had been sexually abused by her stepfather during adolescence. Later, she confessed to having had sexual relations with Don's own father, attempting to portray herself as a victim. In the days that followed, Susan tried desperately to re-establish contact, but the young man simply ignored her. On October 25th, she left work early and picked up her 2 children from daycare. She met a friend and told him about her breakup, while they talked in a parking lot. She asked him to watch the children for a few minutes while she visited Don at his office, but he dismissed her quickly. The woman drove aimlessly, with Michael and Alexander in the back seat, until around 8 p.m., when she headed toward Lake Jordan Long. And it is precisely at this point that the story becomes hazy. Susan Smith claimed she intended to kill herself along with her 2 children, but she panicked at the last minute and fled the car as it plunged into the water. In fact, this would become her official statement, but it does not explain why she didn't try to help them, or why she tried to get rid of them, because they represented an obstacle to her love life. Susan Smith was a depressed woman who had experienced numerous traumatic events and suffered from emotional deprivation, but she was also manipulative, dishonest, narcissistic, and excessively dependent on romantic relationships. She tried to deceive the entire country by inventing the kidnapping story, hoping to get away with it. Michael and Alexander Smith were buried in the cemetery of the Bogans-Build Methodist Church on November 6, 1994, inside a single coffin. The funeral, televised across the country, drew more than 5,000 people who came to offer their condolences. The images of David Smith weeping bitterly were simply devastating. The young father still did not know how to react to what had happened. As months passed and the trial neared, the press began speculating about a possible death penalty for the murdering mother. Newsweek magazine published an article claiming the woman had watched as 3-year-old Michael peered out the car window as the vehicle sank. One of Susan Smith's lawyers, Dave and Brooke, denied that version, and was skilled enough to turn it to her advantage, insisting the media was inventing lies to prejudge her client. The trial began in 1995, and Susan Smith pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. While the prosecution demanded the death penalty, Susan's defense attorneys, Brooke and Judy Clark, presented a mental health expert who diagnosed her with dependent personality disorder and severe depression. The expert claimed she was not aware of her actions when she killed her children. They also brought up her tragic childhood, the early loss of her father, the years of abuse by her stepfather, and her 2 suicide attempts. All efforts by the prosecution to prove that Susan Smith was fully conscious of what she did failed. They tried to appeal to her behavior with other men or her impulsive spending to portray her as evil, but it only helped the defense because it merely confirmed her supposed mental illness. Perhaps the most shocking and painful moment of the trial came when the prosecution played a video made by police recreating the vehicle's immersion into Lake Jordan Long. A camera was placed inside the car as it plunged into the water. It took over 5 minutes to sink completely. The jury watched in real time what Michael and Alexander experienced during their final minutes of life. Many present began to cry, including Susan Smith. On July 25, 1995, after 2.5 hours of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict. Susan Smith was found guilty of the murder of Michael and Alexander and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after serving 30 years. The community was outraged by the decision. Most demanded the death penalty. Her husband David gave a press conference in which he expressed his sorrow. "I will never forget what Susan did, and I will never forget Michael and Alex. My family and I are disappointed that the death penalty wasn't the final verdict." David Smith later agreed to be interviewed on the famous Oprah show, delivering one of the most dramatic television moments ever, a scene that moved even the host to tears and millions of viewers worldwide. Years later, he rebuilt his life. He remarried. He had 2 more children. To this day, Susan Smith remains behind bars, but she could be eligible for release in 2024 at age 53. Specialists who have treated her say she shows no signs of remorse. During her time in prison, she has caused nothing but trouble. She engaged in sexual relationships with 2 correctional officers, who were later fired. She was accused of using drugs. She attempted suicide by slashing her wrists. She manipulates other inmates at will and constantly seeks attention. In 2015, she sent a letter to the newspaper The State, explaining to journalist Hearts on Aging what happened that October 25, 1994. "I am not the monster society believes me to be. I am far from it. Something went very wrong that night. I wasn't myself. I was a good mother. I love my children. It wasn't a planned event. I wasn't in my right mind. The only reason I lied is because I didn't know how to tell the people who loved Michael and Alex that they would never see them again. What hurts me most is that people think I hurt my children to be famous. That's very far from the truth. Honestly, Susan." She cried on TV. She drowned her kids. And America believed her. Share this before the next one does the same.